How's it going? So, I got issues with my 1988 Honda CBR 600 F1 or Hurricane. So, I've been trying to resurrect this bike for a while, making a big mess, all that good stuff. So, the problem I'm having is going to be right down in here, right by this guy in the back there. That nice fuel pump. So, now the problem I'm experiencing precisely is the fact that when I turn the bike on, and I don't know if you could hear that, but there was clicking, and that clicking is coming from that guy right there. So, let me direct it right there and try and start it again. So that's where that clicking is coming from. Now, I've gone through all the connections. This is an old bike, sat around for a long time. But I checked all the connections. All the connections seem to be working. Nothing seems to be fried in the electrical system, as far as I know, because this wiring harness is kind of shitty. So it goes back in here, back in there. So where the fuel pump connects is right here. And you hear it clicking, so I think, based on what I know, that's working. I mean, it should still function and start up because there's fuel in the float bowls, and I've checked that. So it should still start, but for some reason, I don't know if it's the engine compression. So we got the spark plug caps down there, which everything on this bike is stupidly old, and pretty much this whole bike is all original, everything. So a few theories I've had, this may be wrong, but what we got in here is the fuse box. It usually looks like that with the cover on, and I was thinking that maybe one of these fuses blew, and so I had two spares here. So I went ahead and rearranged these so that I changed the fuel pump fuse in here, or at least what it says on here is fuel CHG ST ignition. No, which I assume had a problem with it, but I changed it out and that didn't seem to have any effect. So I figured, since if one of the fuses is going to be blown, let me replace them all. And I replaced the two that I would have thought, which would have been the headlights or the fuel. Because now this is an entirely different problem, which I'm about to state here, is the fact that I took this bike apart, and let me tell you what I did when I took the bike apart. I took off the front fender fairing right there on the tires, and I went back in here. I took that off, which nothing back here would have any effect on the fuel pump, I don't think. I didn't mess with any electrics. The only electrics I messed with is I disconnected those, which I believe are the fuses for the rear tail lights. And then I took the fuel pump off once, which I don't think would have, because I got a new fuel pump. The old one is this Mitsubishi one right here, which I think was the original fuel pump from the bike. So I took it off and I tested the wires with a jump starter and a few other power sources, 12-volt battery and stuff. And this one still works. It makes the shocky blue stuff, like the little pulse waves and whatever, when I test it with a starter. So it seems like it works when it's taken off the bike, which I think is the same premise for what's going on here. When I take it off the bike, it still works. So that leads me to believe that it's something electrical, but I can't find out what it is. Now back to what I was saying. when I was taking apart the bike, I took off the radiator completely. I disconnected these hoses. I went in there, took the head gasket cover off, or the cylinder head cover, disconnected all those bolts, took all that off so I could replace these, because I was getting coolant leakage right there, so I could tighten the bolts that go from up here to down there. Tighten those bolts to make sure the coolant wouldn't leak anymore. So it seemed I fixed that problem, and then while I was in there, it looked like a lot of the plugs were gas fouled. So I went in there, replaced all those, gapped those, and that was that for down there. I also went ahead and I disconnected the dash here, which comes in, and it's these two plugs. It's this green one and it's this black one right here. So I disconnected those two. I didn't disconnect any of these ones in the wiring harness, which comes out of the fuse box right here, which goes up here, and that turns into the three right here that you see. I didn't disconnect any of those, or it turns into those two, the red and the yellow. So I didn't disconnect any of those. I disconnected the dash. Under here, everything's good. I rechecked everything in here. That's properly tightened. Everything else is, all the connections are good, which I don't think that would have anything to do with it. But where I'm getting to with all these electrical connections is the fact that I went ahead and I turned on the bike when I first put it all back together. I had everything back together except for the fairings. So I didn't have the fairings on the bike. I turned it on and I started it, and I was like, okay. So it started up and there was a few problems, a few major problems. First off, I took it for a ride just around the block, and the problem seemed to be that it wouldn't necessarily it shifted gears fine, but when I was riding it around, it barely went over 30 for some reason. And before this, the bike ran fine. I had a few issues with the electrical connections before, which kind of just seemed to go away. And then I got the carbs cleaned about 3 months ago. But the fact of the matter is that there was some electrical problems when I first got the bike. I was fixing it up using just a project bike. But so the electrical connections were bad. The battery was draining when I first got the bike. That seemed to all go away, so I was like, okay, everything else should just be mechanical problems. But when I turned on the bike and started it for the first time I had the bike back together, I took it around the block, wouldn't go over 30 on the speedometer-ish, 30, 45, and it seemed to, it was weird because it would be in first gear, and when I first took off the bike, it would have full power. So everything was good in first gear when I first started the bike, and I was just pulling out of the driveway. Everything was good. And then I'd ride it for a bit, and it seemed first gear was doing okay. It was maybe making some weird sounds, but it was doing okay and had full power. But I shifted up in the second, and it just completely lost power. And not like lost power as in it died, but it just didn't, like, it didn't increase the amount of power it should have in second gear. And then third gear, fourth gear, fifth gear, sixth gear, it would increase the speed, but it just was not running good. And then eventually it would just stop around 55, and it would not go over 55. It was just done. So, and it had some weird things going on with the tachometer, whatever that's called, and it just was not running right. And that was when I had the original plugs in, because I didn't change the plugs at first. I just changed the plugs yesterday. But that was when I first had the original plugs in. I changed the plugs, did it again, same thing was happening. Well, actually, no, never mind. I'm going to correct myself here. I put the new plugs in, and the bike won't start. But everything's properly gapped, but I also did the thing is I put the new plugs in, and then it was just having issues after I put the new plugs in, pretty much. I mean, the only thing that I really took apart was the head cover and the plugs. And sorry if I'm repeating myself, it's just train of thought. But head cover, spark plugs, replace the spark plugs, all four of them, replace them cylinder by cylinder. I have the correct ignition caps in each of the slots, at least I think, because they're confusing as hell, and someone marked them who previously owned the bike. This is an 88, by the way, and it only has 13,000 miles on it, so I don't know how many owners it had, but couldn't have been much. But it had, like, for the fourth cylinder here, it's got like a 4 and a 2 on it. For God knows why, I don't know. But it's a little confusing, but from what I've seen on the manual and how these lines correspond back there and up there, that they're in the correct position on there right now. But I don't know if it's the engine compression, something to do with the carb timing. I mean, since I took the spark plugs out, I think it might be engine compression is why it's not getting proper sparks, but that doesn't explain, at least in my mind, as a, like, not a professional mechanic. I mean, I know a lot about bikes, but not carbureted and everything. But the carbureted bikes are a little bit more sketchy in my book. But from this guy, it doesn't explain why the engine compression or the carb timing would be making this guy click. And my tank's over there, so I'll put the tank on. And when I put the tank on and connect it right here, there should be fuel traveling down here, through here, back there, back out there, into the float bowls. So that's going to be these guys right up here. And I recently just drained the float bowls and took all the fuel out, and the fuel was not looking good for the fact that I think there's rust inside the tank. Let's see if I can get the fuel over here. Right here is what the fuel looked like. So it's like that kind of, I don't know if you'll be able to see it over camera, but it's like a rusty color, kind of a really light pink almost. And it's got little chunks of rust in there, you can see. But I replaced the fuel pump, and I get a fuel filter in today, but I don't think the fuel filter is going to do anything because the pump is just, the pump's just not drawing anything because it's just clicking. When I start the bike, it goes along with the starter, and it just will not pick up any fuel from the tank, take it down, and put it into the float bowls, which is why I'm thinking that it's not starting because it's not getting any fuel. So I'm puzzled as to why this is happening. It could be something super simple, and I'm just dumb. That's very much so a possibility. But I've checked a lot of things, and I don't know why this would be happening, because I've removed the connection for the regulator here. The connection's good on that. I don't know if the regulator has anything to do with the fuel pump. It might. I'm not good with the electronics. I'm good with the mechanicals of bikes, not the ECUs and whatever else. This guy comes from the pulse timer down there, which what I've read online, that the pulse timer is what makes the fuel pump work. So I'm not sure if this may be fried, but then again, I have these fuses here, and I had extra fuses that I originally got with the bike, and those are what I used to replace them. So I didn't get new fuses. I just ordered new fuses. So I'm hoping that when I replace these fuses, that's gonna change that. And there's also a 30A fuse on this side of the bike, which is gonna be right here. And then there was a replacement under here, which I didn't even know existed. So I replaced this fuse and it still had the same result. So I don't know if that fuse was bad and the fuse in there is bad. And when you take that off, the fuse will just be right in there with the plugs. And I think that's the fuse for the battery. But the whole bike is still getting power. So it doesn't make much sense that this fuse would be blown, because then the battery, at least I think this is to the battery back in there. Goes back there. There's the battery.